Hello and welcome back to Everything History. If you're just joining us, we're sort of in medias res right now, meaning in the middle of things, but feel free to listen. If you find it difficult to keep up, feel free to listen to the previous 2 or 3 episodes to get the full picture. That being said, I've decided to add a previously on piece after the intro sequence to allow everyone to ease back into the story. Also, don't forget to rate and subscribe on iTunes. It really helps us out. And with all that out of the way, let's get the show rolling.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
As I've said before, let's go over quickly what we've already covered. I want to ease you back into the complicated French Revolution, not just dunk you in. So, previously on Everything History. Back in early 1787, King Louis XVI and his ministers realized France was in danger due to their overwhelming financial debts and obligations. They also determined that their society was far too ancient and feudalistic to be sustainable in a modern 18th century European nation-state. To resolve these and other issues, the monarchy set about developing a series of reforms. These changes were radical. They would have completely overhauled the French tax code by making it far more balanced. They also would have changed the political and governmental structure of the entire kingdom by making a push away from the old regime's medieval system of governance. King Louis had the authority to authorize the national revisions by himself, but he desired to keep stability, so he sought the approval of the Parliament of Paris. With their approval, he would assure himself and hopefully put France on the path to recovery. The problem was the Parliament did not approve. In fact, they adamantly disapproved and set about organizing a massive resistance against the king's measures. King Louis and his government was not prepared for this and were completely caught off balance. For the next several months, France remained in political gridlock, and as more time passed, the more the public lost faith in the king and the government. The monarchy was bombarded by clergy, nobles, and peasants alike and was overwhelmed by the press. As the monarchy's approval tanked, the king was forced to fire several of his ministers and abandon his first push for reforms. As the gridlock waned, the government was forced to accept more loans to stay afloat in late 1787. And as France limped into 1788, the privileged classes began begging King Louis to convene the Estates General. King Louis wanted to avoid that at all costs, though, and in conjunction with his ministers, many of them being new, sought to pass judicial reforms in May of 1788. These reforms would have officially made the many parliaments of France useless, but they didn't stand a chance of passing. The king and his administration tried to force the reforms through for about 2 months, but anarchy exploded across France in late May, June, and July. This swell of public unrest led to death and violence at Grenoble on June 7th. King Louis XVI then backed off and announced that he would convene the Estates General on May 1st, 1789. Several more of his ministers, after being dragged through the dirt by the French press, then resigned and fled to the countryside, or even out of the country in some cases. Jacques Necker was then reappointed as financial minister as the king descended into political silence. Necker then began managing essentially all of the functions of government and state for the next few months. Finally, we left off in November of 1788 as the Assembly of Notables convened to decide how to handle the elections and representation for the upcoming Estates General. Thus our story recommences in the middle of a struggle. That needs specification though, because there was always a large struggle in late 18th century France. In this case, the struggle was between the French public and the French aristocracy. The aristocrats being the clergy and nobles of the First and Second Estates, and the majority of them wanted to have the Estates General convene exactly as it had when it had last convened in 1614. This would have meant, though, that all 3 estates of France would have equal representation at roughly 300 representatives per estate. The Third Estate, meaning basically the public, was having none of this. The people demanded a far higher number of representatives. After all, the Third Estate constituted about 27.4 million of the French population of only 28 million. And due to this, in the fall of 1788, the people of the Third banded together under the rallying cry, "Double the Third." The popular cry to double the representation of the Third Estate was echoed in the political literature being printed across France, so that even the most remote peasant of France had heard the demand of the people. Jacques Necker and the royal government announced that the procedure for the coming Estates General would be decided by the Assembly of Notables, which, as we already know, began their talks on November 6th. King Louis began the proceedings by saying, Before convoking the Estates General, I consult you with respect to the form which I ought to prefer in order to render the Estates General more useful to all my kingdom. After this, the king then handed it off to Jacques Necker. Mr. Necker led the proceedings in the king's stead thereafter, and he proposed scores of questions to the notables. But the people outside Versailles only cared about one question. Should the Third Estate acquire double the representation? The Assembly of Notables voted down the idea, with 33 in favor and 111 against. The people knew of this vote immediately and went into a frenzy. The government was bombarded with nearly 1,000 petitions in favor of doubling the third, and an anonymous citizen wrote on November 24th, quote, "There is no talk of anything but the claims of the Third Estate. Nothing is written but pamphlets about the form of the Estates General." The monarchy wisely sat on the issue and allowed the notables to debate all the way into December as Necker and the king waited to act. But as winter descended again on France, the poverty of the country was exacerbated further. For 1788 had been an extremely poor year for the farmers. The crops were struck by 2 massive hailstorms in the summer, and weather patterns provided no relief as drought set in throughout the countryside. Farmers in the south of France even declared that the ground had been reduced to an arid desert. This thoroughly blighted French harvests, and food prices had nowhere to go but up. France had been struggling with food shortages for quite some time, but the country was running on empty as winter blanketed France. Famine was an everyday problem for tens of thousands of families as 1789 began. I want you to imagine that, your everyday thought being occupied by hunger pains and the fear that your children were starving or being partially malnourished. If this was the case for you, how much confidence would you have in your government? And how much hatred and resentment would you hold in your heart for the noble classes that never did anything to help you or your family? Now, I'm not saying all nobles were like that, but I am saying that that's what a lot of people thought during this time period. And I really want you to keep in mind the regular men and women that experienced this climactic period of history. They are not some names on a page or some anonymous bystanders in a story. These were real people that were struggling to survive. And by remembering them, we honor them, and by understanding their conditions, we can better comprehend why certain upcoming events happened at all. And it was these very people that shouldered the burden of France's old regime. And sadly, the winter of 1788 provided the worst in decades for France. The rivers and waterways snapped into a rapid early freeze. This early freeze prevented both the production and transportation of cereal food products. Snow was said to fall every other day all the way into April. Stories of birds freezing on perches and wolves coming down from the mountains spread throughout. France appeared to be experiencing some sort of mythological torture engineered by God. The nobleman Comte de Mirabeau said in January, quote, "Every scourge has been unloosed. Everywhere I have found men dead of cold and hunger, for lack of wheat and flour, all the mills being frozen." For many it seemed as if France was being punished by God. To most, France seemed to be free-falling towards collapse. Some even spoke of it as a societal apocalypse. And as 1789 began, the price of bread had now doubled. The average French family of 4 was now spending at least 75% of their daily wage on bread alone. Most, though, did not even have enough for that. For 1/5 of the population was now having to stretch 6 to 9 loaves of bread across 4 people a whole week. Not to mention the price of firewood, rent, and of course taxes. What this meant is that life was borderline unlivable for the average family in France during this time. The government, however, was fully aware of the situation, and Necker set about trying to prevent famine in France. Necker outlawed the exportation of grain out of France and spent millions on the importation of grain and rice to be given out freely to the impoverished, unemployed, and unfortunate. These measures were the best the government could do, and while they helped in some small measure, they sadly went unnoticed by most. The winter of 88-89 had been a harrowing journey, but most still believed, by the end of it, that the problems of the nation could be rectified. The Estates General provided that hope, and May of 1789 was the date on everyone's calendars. It gave people hope that recovery and personal freedom was on the way. And speaking of the Estates, let's shift back to the Assembly of Notables in late November. The Assembly continued to debate, despite the fact that they had voted down the proposal to double the third. Necker and the king began to worry, and Mr. Necker wrote in mid-December to a colleague, quote, "Frightful dissensions are breaking out everywhere. The demand is that the Third Estate have a double representation in the Estates General. If the Third Estate obtains the double representation by force, all will be lost. The third, in its irritation, will no longer know any moderation. This was the fear of Necker and many others, and Necker went on in his letter to say, quote, "Let us grant the double representation to the third estate. This sacrifice is necessary to prevent a greater misfortune." So by December, both the monarchy and the people began to look for answers outside the Assembly of Notables. Therefore, Necker and the king disbanded the assembly and called upon the advice of the Parliament of Paris, asking again the question of doubling the third. This time the proceedings went differently. The reason the proceedings with the Parliament went different this time is because of all the political and societal pressure placed on the members of the Parliament. The nobles of the body had been in Paris for the past month and had personally felt the passion and resolves of the people. They were honestly afraid of the wrath of the people, and they hoped to win the graces of the public when they came into session. More than that, many provincial assemblies and governors throughout the country petitioned the Parliament, its members, and the king to reconsider doubling the third. So in mid-December, the Parliament of Paris narrowly approved the notion of doubling the representation of the third estate, but the final decision still lay with King Louis. Necker and the king spent the week of Christmas discussing their stance on the matter, and on December 27th, the decision came down. In a publication called The Result of the King's Council of State, the king sided with the people. The third was to be doubled. The monarchy also declared that all representatives would be elected through a complex electoral system. The election would include 234 separate constituencies, each with 3 electoral ballots for each estate. And matters got far more detailed than even that, but suffice it to say, the public felt that they had won a victory in the autumn campaigns of 1788. And as everyone struggled through the winter, they looked forward to the elections, which were set to begin in February and March. Any man could try and be on the ballot, but to earn a spot you had to navigate a confusing bureaucratic maze. Not many were able to make it through the process, and it ended up being almost entirely lawyers and clerics on the ballot, with a sprinkling of artisans, notaries, and practitioners. As the massive electoral machine began to gear itself up for what was to be Europe's largest democratic experiment, the literature of the times focused on the future. People in all social circles discussed what should be done at the Estates General. The main topic being discussed was the constitution of the government. At current, the sovereign of France technically had authority over all, and the noble aristocrats and clergy were his advisors. Technically. This system had failed miserably, though, to the point where the fate of the government and its officials was unknown. Did the power reside with the king, with the clergy, with the nobles, or with the people? Most believed it still resided with the king, but that hadn't stopped them from resisting him at every turn. So in early 1789, everyone with access to a printing press was publishing their own ideas on how the Estates General should change the government and its constitution. One pamphlet addressed directly to the notables, but published publicly, said, in warning, that if the Estates General failed, then, quote, "Instead of escaping despotism, we shall fall back under the yoke, 1,000 times more terrible, of feudal aristocracy." Many prominent citizens argued for a cautious course. They suggested the preservation of the current constitution and a focus instead on economic recovery and stimulus. But what is the French Constitution? That is a difficult question because it was not a whole written document like the U.S. Constitution, which, by the way, was actually being written, discussed, and implemented during this exact time period between 1788 and 89. A prominent French Enlightenment philosopher, statesman, and nobleman, Comte de Volney, asked these very questions in a pamphlet that roughly translates to the necessary conditions for the Estates General. Volney asked, quote, "But what is the Constitution? By whom was it made, and where is it?" Another aristocrat, Comte de Serrant, defended the current governmental system and argued against democratizing the French government. Serrant spoke for the majority of the French elite and responded by stating that the French Constitution was, quote, "written in the hearts of the French. It is to be found in the capitularies of the Frankish kings, in the ordinance of the Louvre, in the formulas of the royal coronations, and in the most respectable documents of history." Serrant then stated that the Constitution need not be changed, but argued that the estates simply needed to trim in the abuses and corruption of the aforementioned Constitution. Volney and the people did not buy into Serrant's figurative argument about the Constitution. They didn't buy the argument by the privilege to leave the Constitution alone, either. They were overwhelmingly in favor of constitutional change. Volney voiced their demands, saying, quote, "I open the collections of our laws, and I find only old and barbarous ordinances, inapplicable to our own times. But supposing that we have a constitution that our ancestors consented to, does it follow that we are obliged to keep this constitution unchanged?" Many aristocrats like Serrant said yes, you shouldn't change it, but Volney answered, "Certainly not. It is the principle of the public law, of the natural law of mankind, that one generation cannot bind another. Without this ability to change established constitution, the majority of the nations would be condemned to eternal servitude. Comte de Volney then went on to stress the importance of representing the people in the government and promoted the idea of republicanism akin to that developing in the still young United States. These views were echoed by the majority. The people began to hope and demand that the Estates General would introduce democracy and republicanism into the French government. American founding father Gouverneur Morris was living in Paris during this time and wrote to a French colleague of his on March 8th, saying, quote, "The seeds of liberty are already sown. Republicanism is a moral influenza from which neither titles, places, nor even the diadem can guard." And in the beginning of 1789, the people began to do more than just write philosophical literature. Groups were organized and several widely signed petitions were sent to King Louis. For example, a group called the Women of the Third Estate sent a petition asking the king, quote, "Could women not make their voices heard? We prefer, sire, to place our cause at your feet. Sire, we ask that men not be allowed to exercise trades that are the prerogative of women, and we implore you, sire, to set up free schools where we women might learn our language, principles, religion, and ethics." All of this and more was asked of the king, and it seemed the country was massively divided and split. The Women of the Third Estate provide a great example of the societal juxtaposition going on. Because in the beginning of their petition, they wrote that they lived, quote, "at a time when everyone seeks to make the most of his titles and rights, while others make every effort to shake off the last links that still bind them to the imperious remains of feudalism." And yet, at the very end of their plea, they wrote to their king, quote, "We see you only a tender father, for whom we would give our lives 1,000 times. There's a lot of figurative language in both of those statements, but it shows the push and pull tension within French society in 1789. The king, for his part, remained silent during this time as he waited for the elections. And that brings us in a roundabout way to the elections for the deputies of the Estates General. The complex election got underway in late February. Every district had a slightly different election date, so the election process extended all the way into late April. As you might imagine, a democratic process taking place over a period of months came with its share of problems. It became very difficult to keep order as many protests were sprouting up as spring began. Most elections, however, were settled by mid-April. The First Estate elected 303 deputies, and the vast majority of these clerics were regular parish priests, not members of the church hierarchy. For the nobles of the Second Estate, the majority of those appointed were minor nobles or leaders in favor of constitutional reform. The masses had locked out all but 22 of all judges and high-class conservatives from becoming deputies. Overall, there were about 322 nobles appointed as deputies. The elections for the Third Estate, however, did not go so easily. The passions of the populace reached a new high watermark in late April. There was much fear and suspicion that the aristocracy was going to try and rig the elections or extort voters in some way, and this fear had been fanned by Third Estate leaders. The crowds of peasants and commoners only needed a spark to explode into violence. That spark came around April 23rd when a manufacturer named Reveillon said that the prices of bread should be lowered so people with a lower wage could make ends meet. That's what Reveillon actually said, but a rumor got out that he had said he was going to lower his workers' wages. No one bothered to verify this misinformation, and a rage-filled mob assembled during the night. And this was no small riot. The riot swelled to consume the entire Saint-Antoine district of Paris, and at several points spread to the other districts as well. The rioters were fueled by conspiracy theories and a truly crazed mob mentality. On the night of the 26th, they set out to pour Reveillon's home and factory. By the time the crowd reached the factory, it had swelled to over 3,000 people. Torches were lit, and the crowd chanted into the night, "Death to the rich, death to the aristocrats." Everything went wrong after that, and the riots continued for 3 straight days. During that time, armed guards were called out. Duke Orleans even tried to calm the crowds by tossing bags of money. Yes, that actually happened, but none of it worked. The mob finally turned to mayhem and violence, and in their stupidity, they destroyed Reveillon's factory and home. Reveillon and his family barely escaped a lynching as well. It was absolute chaos. Bonfires were lit, and the violence only spread further. Finally, the military was called in, and quickly the crowd tried to fight even them. The French soldiers had seen enough. They fired into the crowd and forcibly removed the rioters. When the Reveillon riots were finally over, 25 people were dead, over 300 injured, and dozens of buildings had been either destroyed or damaged. This sort of chaos and violence served little purpose, but to us it foreshadows the bleak future of the French Revolution. And just because the rowdiness and violence had temporarily calmed and subsided, that did not mean that anything was resolved. The people were still very unhappy and would turn to violence again when the situation arose. The elections for the Third Estate did complete, though, and without governmental meddling. The Third Estate elected 545 members, and unlike the other two estates, the deputies of the Third were united in their resolve. Let's clean up the numbers, though, for these appointed deputies, because it's actually quite confusing. It is confusing because while I would like to say that there are 300 clergy, 300 nobles, and 600 members of the Third Estate, that is not true. It's pretty close, but not entirely accurate. The truth is, it depends entirely on how you count. In the way I counted the deputies, there were 303 for the clergy, 322 for the nobles, and 545 for the common people. By that logic, though, that would mean that the Third Estate had actually not received double the amount of representatives. Yet while those numbers are accurate, they require some explaining. You see, you could run for any of the elections on the ballot for any of the estates. And that meant some clergy and nobles that sided with the views of the Third Estate ran for office on the ballot of the Third Estate. For example, Comte de Mirabeau and Marquis de Lafayette were noblemen who supported the people and were elected as representatives of the Third Estate, not the Second Estate. So with this knowledge in hand, if you run the numbers again, you would find that the First Estate had 296 deputies, the Second Estate 282, and the Third Estate 578. That is basically the gist of the election situation, and the 1,200 or so deputies were called to meet King Louis XVI and Monsieur Necker on May 5th in Versailles to decide the future of France at the Estates General of 1789. This episode ends there, with France on the brink of great change. When we return, the Estates General, with all its pomp and circumstance, will convene, and France will be launched into revolution. I'll let Gouverneur Morris foreshadow the next episode. He wrote to Comte de Moustier on March 11th saying, quote, "Your nation is now in a most important crisis. The reverence for the ancient establishment's gone, existing forms shaken to the very foundation, and a new order of things is about to take place in France."
Thank you, and good night.